Everybody, I think we're going to start. There'll be some stragglers likely because of the seriously bad parking situation out there. But I think it's time we get going. So I want to thank you all for coming, you brave people who weren't afraid of a few raindrops. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Rhoda Shermer, I'm the president, and I appreciate your being here. I want to thank the League of Women Voters of Northern Valley and the League of Women Voters of Fairlawn for helping us make tonight's program possible. Thanks, guys. Thanks very much. Let's give them a hand. Before we start this evening's program, I want to inform you of our next program that will be at FDU, and that will take on the issue of universal health care, because we're hearing a lot in the papers now and on the all the media about Medicare for all, single payer, and there's lots of options with the universal health care idea. So you're going to hear some really tremendous speakers on April 18th back here in this auditorium. So keep that in mind and go to our website where you will regularly see us posting upcoming programs, not all of which are here at FDU. Some are in Union County, some in Somerset County, some in Morris County. So take a look and see what we're doing. Also, what we have for you on the table, and I hope it will be there when you're ready to leave after tonight's program, is a prepared reading list so that you can take it home and you can take a look at some good readings that our two speakers provided and that we found from other sources also. So we're providing you with that. I think you'll enjoy that. At the end of the speaker's presentation, we're going to have our usual exciting and dynamic question and answer session. So I'm going to have to ask all of you to be fair so that everybody gets a chance to ask their questions. I know some of you would like to make comments, and that's important, but keep it to a minimum so that we can pass the mic around and everybody has a chance to ask their questions. So thank you very much. And with that, I would like to tell you we have two marvelous women here tonight who are going to address the issues of racism. And our first speaker will be Barbara Olchansky. I'm going to introduce both of them, and then Barbara will go first, and our second speaker, Lorna Hines, will come second. So now to tell you a little bit about Barbara. Barbara has a long and prestigious career championing human rights causes. A graduate of Stanford University Law School, she clerked for the Honorable Rose Elizabeth Byrd, Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, and was appointed the Leah Kaplan Visiting Professor of Human Rights at Stanford. In addition to serving on the faculty of the University of Maryland Law School, she worked 12 years as Deputy Legal Director for the Center for Constitutional Rights. In that role, Barbara earned praise for her courageous leadership as Director Counsel of Guantanamo Global Justice Initiative, and I think you've probably all heard of that. Barbara's resume is way too long to discuss here, but I want you to welcome Barbara Olchansky. Our second speaker will be Lorna Hines-Cunningham, and she's another prize winner. Lorna received the New Jersey Mental Health Association's prestigious Community Leadership Award and was described as a visionary. Her 40-year career has found Lorna holding senior cabinet positions in New York State and New Jersey's Office of Mental Health. Lorna is currently adjunct professor at Ramapo College, where she teaches graduate students on cultural diversity, racism, privilege, and oppression. And as with Barbara, Lorna's resume is long and very healthy. So for more information on these speakers, you can go to our website, or you can just contact us, or maybe Google the speakers themselves. So let's welcome Lorna Hines-Cunningham. So we're going to begin the program with Barbara. Barbara?
Do I need this? Do you think? Yes? Everyone's saying yes. Okay. I'm going to try and figure out how this works. Okay, there we go. So I titled this One Person's Thoughts on the Matter of Structural Racism for a number of reasons. One, it's just me, and there are so many different thoughts about what makes up structural racism, the different types of racism that it encompasses, and how we should handle it. And so this is a view from the work that I have done as a lawyer. I have been a civil and human rights lawyer for my entire career, and although I might not look like it, I continue that work today. It has branched into some, after the Guantanamo work, some more international work, but mostly I'm not talking about that today. Because I'm a lawyer, and everyone knows that every time a lawyer opens their mouth, they have to start with a caveat. So, and that's the very first thing they teach us. So I'm not going to deprive you of this tradition today. I have a few of them. First, what I'm about to say tonight is really nothing new. I think everyone in this room probably knows the facts and the circumstances that we're going to be talking about. What I hope is that by putting things together and by bringing together different perspectives from different disciplines, maybe we can see things a little bit differently. Because I am an official crackpot, I, at the ripe old age of 50, went back to public health school, which was a hideous experience. But that means that I do see things now from a range through the lens of a number of different disciplines. And so they're interwoven here. I know that given the time that we have, there is so much that I'm leaving out. And I know that all of you probably have a million things to say about it. So I just want to say right now, I know I missed so many. Tonight, when I'm talking about what I think is happening in this country, I use the collective pronoun we. And I use it when we're talking about structural racism, white supremacy, white privilege, because I think everyone is implicated. This doesn't mean everyone is a white supremacist. It doesn't mean everyone holds all these beliefs or acts in the ways that we're going to be looking at. And nor do I mean to say that there are people in this country that do all of these things. But the way I think out of the situation that we're in is for everyone to look at all of these things and think about what it means in their life every day as they interact with people. So I think we all know, because we have a certain person in the White House and many others in the administration, that there are many people that harbor very discriminatory ideas and undertake very troubling actions, large and small ones, walls at the border in Mexico, at the frontera, systematic and personal, and that we have an administration that appoints people to roles of tremendous power who hold these views. For that reason, I think it's our responsibility to do something right now, to change this. I think all of us, it takes everyone to make a change And I think that we need to be telling people about what we see and doing it all the time. Okay. The last of my caveats, my motivation. What I hope is that I might be able to give you a few things to think about, not only in terms of collective action at the governmental level, but action in your personal, individual life, in the hope that these kinds of things will help make the world a more humane and compassionate place. Right now, I don't think that the vast majority of people living in this country, people of color, are living a life of dignity. I don't. And I see it every day. And we need to make people hear it, and we need to make sure that people feel heard. Okay, the fallacy of race. This is one thing that public health school helped me with. Over the last 35 years, there's been a tremendous growth in our information about the human genome and our understanding of the idea of race. And it is now an accepted scientific reality that the idea of biological races is not a viable theory. This doesn't mean that people don't look different. You know, there are traits that co-vary, but there are more than 3 million traits. And when you look at populations, the differences within a population in a particular place, let's say Namibia, Southern Africa, are greater within that population than they are between that population and the Japanese. And so our understanding of the genetic basis of race is that there is none. However, despite this fact, and despite the number of studies that are out there, and despite the fact that people will say, oh, I know there's no biological basis, there are very, very deep political attachments to this idea, to the idea that racial categories represent biological divisions among people, and they're based on genetic differences. So why are people holding on to this? What's the story about this? And for that, I'm going to go back to the formation of the nation. The first Europeans that came to this land as colonizers didn't call themselves white. They were English, German, French. They were from everywhere. Over half of those who came in that very early period were servants. And as people made their livings in this country, the gap between the rich and the poor grew. And many Europeans started to see class lines being sharpened and began to fear that their servants and the tenant farmers and the African slaves might join together and overthrow them. So what they did, looking at how far they were outnumbered, is they did what we all know so well, divide and control. European servants were given the rights to acquire and own land, join militias, carry guns, make a living, make money, and all of those rights were denied slaves. And the slave code legalized, at the same time, legalized the idea of chattel slavery, right? You are a piece of property of somebody. And so if you were an African slave, you were a Negro, and that was the same thing as slave. And even if you happened to be a free African, you were still restricted in all of those rights. So how did this work? Well, to go along with those privileges, those in the servant class who were legally declared whites on the basis of their continental origin and their skin color vis-a-vis the blacks, that is how people were divided. The whiteness of the European servants was deemed to make them superior to blacks and Indians. So whiteness was a means of preventing lower class Europeans from joining people of color against their common class enemies. However, as in South Africa, another and later settler nation, the construction of this idea of the superiority of whiteness not only became a source of unity and power within that community, but a justification for repression and extreme brutality. And that is what became the foundation of white supremacy and white privilege in this country. So, the origin myth. Every country has a creation story. We know what ours is. We were all told about it when we were kids. Columbus sailed with his 3 ships, found this great land. But what I have to say is that this myth ignores 4 major foundation stones upon which this nation was built. The land base. Well, we do know that there were people here when the colonizers came. There are estimates of between 9 and 20 million indigenous people that were on this continent in North America. The brutal Indian Wars reduced that number to less than 500,000. The land that was stolen was not just traded for trinkets like the story of the island of Manhattan. It was land from New York to the Carolinas, to Georgia, across into the country. And the economic base for the country was, of course, the slave trade. The money that was made as the foundation of the country was the sale of cotton. And that was all on the backs of African slaves. And, of course, the indigenous people that were brought into slavery as well. The expansion. The expansion was, of course, the land that we took from Mexico and the war against Mexico. And that meant all of Texas, much of northern parts of Mexico, all the way across the country to Baja California, with the goal of getting to the Pacific coast. The Pacific coast opened up the Far East and Asia to our markets. And so now we have the expansion. This is the foundation of this country. The justification. Everyone knows the phrase manifest destiny. I don't think in school we quite teach it the way that it was actually articulated at the time by President James Polk. James Polk was pretty clear that manifest destiny meant that God gave the white people the divine right to dominate all other peoples, to seize their land, to own and use that land, and even destroy that land, and also, in the name of building this country, killing those around them. The arrogance of asserting that God gave white people entire dominion over everything still drives the machinery of America today. And that means it still sustains and reinvigorates racist oppression in this country. And we have an administration now that uses these exact words to describe what his view of this country is. So, what does that look like in real time? Well, the political doctrine of manifest destiny and institutionalized racism, they're profoundly linked. But there were people who opposed the expansion at that time. But it wasn't for the good reasons that we might hope. It was for racist reasons. And these are what they were. They didn't like the idea of having the degraded Mexican Spanish, who are a wretched people, who are mongrels, being part of the United States. Sound familiar, anyone? Black people should have been removed from US soil to avoid contamination of white people by inferior people. And Native Americans were dirty heathen savages, inferior in their values, mostly because their belief was in common ownership of the world. They were stewards of the earth for 7 generations to come. And that was a very dangerous idea when the US wanted ownership. And so they were put on reservations and then later forcibly removed from their own culture. Some definitions. I don't think I really need to read these. I think we all have a sense of how race has been used, even though it's a social construct and nothing else. White supremacy, although it has a myriad meanings today, at the time that we're talking about, at the start of this country, really meant divine rights. But now it means exploitation, oppression, denigration, annihilation of anyone that is seen as not part of the white group in this country. So, since the election of Donald Trump, everyone knows hate crimes have been rising, and white supremacists have been emboldened. And so I just decided I'll pick a few incidents from, it's not even the last year, it's actually like the last 10 months. And this is what we get. The governor of Virginia admitting to wearing blackface during medical school. 2 African-American businessmen waiting for a third are seen as a threat in a Starbucks coffee shop. The police are called and the men are arrested. 3 women leaving an Airbnb in Oakland, California, are swarmed by the police when a neighbor calls in and says she thinks that there's a robbery going on. White golf course owners said that 5 African-American women on the links were playing too slowly and called the police to tell them to leave the course. And LA Fitness Club employees called 911 on 2 African-American men they said had not paid. They had paid. And last, at Yale, a white woman called the police on an African-American fellow student who happened to fall asleep in a dorm common area. These are just a few. There are hundreds of these. The idea that circulates around these, some people call microaggressions. For me, as a civil rights lawyer, I find them to be more than micro. And when I was looking at what people have to say about why this keeps happening, and all day long, every day, to so many people all over the country, I read a piece by Philip Goff, who's the head of the Center for Policing Equity, an amazing organization. And he said that Black people and white people share space, like at a university or a rapidly gentrifying city, but they don't always share bonds, and they don't always talk, and they don't always relate. And so they're not in community with each other. And he says that breeds fear. Goff also said that he worries that police officers are being deputized as a kind of personal racism valet. And when you think about the stories that I just went through, you can see what he means, right? There are armed respondents that are going out based on unfounded suspicions by white Americans. And that is happening all the time. And this is what he said about that. You can't very well instruct your 911 operators to be like, yeah, Mrs. Smith, I know you said that they were gangbangers, but we know you're probably just racist. So how do we deal with that? Right now, it's something that happens to people all the time. So the thing about racism and the way discussions happen about it today is that we look at individual actions, and that gives us a very convenient way of avoiding discussing and dealing with the true, very deep reality of structural racism and white privilege. It leads to these sort of dead-end debates about, well, was it really racist if you used blackface at this point in time? Or when he was wearing a costume to be Michael Jackson, isn't that part of the costume? And did he really mean it? And and this is where the conversation goes. And the problem is, although, of course, it's important to call people to account for what they do, it doesn't move us very far down the road of eliminating structural racism. I found this picture just today. Actually, there was an article about this in the New York Times, and I don't know if people saw it. These are boys from a graduating class of a high school, and they're waiting to go to their prom, and this is their pre-prom photo. And they're all doing the Nazi salute. And several of them, and which you can't really see in this photo, are also flashing the white power sign. What happened here? Well, nothing. The school said that this was a First Amendment right for them to say whatever they wanted, that it might have been a prank, so there's really nothing to do about it. But here's the thing. Racism isn't a matter of personal prejudice or individual acts of meanness or even small groups acts of meanness, nor is it a matter of an individual's moral point of view. It is this web of interlocking and reinforcing institutions, all of them, every aspect of our lives. And it is a malignancy that invaded the walls, the ceilings, and the floors of the structure that we call this country. It affects people's lives in every way, every single day. So, lest we think that white supremacy and white nationalism waned during the mid-1800s, I thought I'd show a few facts from the legal books. 17 states had laws banning interracial marriage, which is, by the way, one of the heart of the doctrine of white supremacy. And that stayed that way until 1967. White supremacy, those words, was the motto of the Alabama Democratic Party until 1966. Oh, and here's the kicker. Mississippi didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 1995. I thought I'd give us a little bit of a picture of what structural racism, what I think structural racism looks like in different systems. What has been happening time and again is that we say that police misconduct is the work of only a few bad apples. And a few more bad apples, and then a few more bad apples, and then a few more bad apples. And as long as we do that, as long as that is the continual refrain, we'll never look at the criminal justice system. We will never look at what it is. What does that mean? I have brought, I don't know how many, 15 class action police misconduct cases. The one that I think might have made a little bit of difference was against the street crimes unit in New York. For those that know, my apologies, for those that don't, this was a rogue operation in which men, not in uniform, not in marked cars, roamed the streets of New York at night, doing what they called tossing young African-American men, basically threatening them within an inch of their lives, beating them, and saying, tell your gangbanging friends that we're going to do this to everyone. What we did get out of that case when we won, and we did win, is that we got to look at the curriculum that's taught in the New York City Police Academy. It hadn't been changed since 1962. So if we don't look at the curriculum, we don't know what's going on. We don't know what people are being taught. We don't look at the diversity of police academies and police forces unless somebody sues. We don't look at how recruiting is done for the academies unless somebody sues. We don't look at how many African-American applicants are accepted, how many become officers, detectives, supervisors, policymakers. And we don't look at what those numbers look like in relation to the populations being served. This we don't look at. Yes, there are sociologists that do studies, but this is not what people are talking about when this keeps happening, when unarmed black men keep being shot down in the streets of this country. This is not what people are talking about. This is what we should be talking about. Every person should know what's in that curriculum. Because if that curriculum is from 1962, and believe me, it said, watch out for the women who might exhibit signs of hysteria. And it quoted Freud. Nice. So if we're looking at curricula like that, it means something is very wrong. And why is it still like this? If we stay in this place where we just refuse to look at these things or to call people to account, this is just going to continue. The police killed 1,100 people in 2017. African Americans were 25% of the people killed, and they're just barely 13% of the population. Officers were charged with a crime in only 13 out of 1,147 cases. This is a chart that I made for another talk from 2015. You can tell it's the same statistic. 99% of the cases didn't result in anyone, well, it should say, being charged or convicted with a crime. What I can't understand is why it's okay to use lethal force in the way that we do in this country. That's another matter that we should be talking about all the time. And for me, yes, I've seen what they do in the UK. Somehow, even if there's a knife attack there, just like here, they managed to diffuse all of those without killing people, except in 4 cases that were terrorism cases, where they thought people had bombs. That's also, by the way, what international law says. So why can't we do this? There's a huge range of techniques, of different types of items that can be used to diffuse a situation. They're not really guns. I guess they're guns that shoot sandbags to take somebody down. There are devices that shoot a net that has weights on the bottom that you can just completely immobilize somebody. There's a million different things. When we saw what there was in the New York City Police Academy, and they gave us a show of all of these things, the question was, why is anyone ever killed if there's all these things? And yet there's only 4 states in this country that require police to do something else besides using deadly force. 4 states. Okay, now I know a little bit about New Jersey, but I'm from New York. But I know in New Jersey you also have a good governor, and in New York they finally have both houses of the legislature and a Democratic governor. If this is not the law in those 2 states after this year, we're all accountable for that. It is not okay that we have all of those means of handling these situations and police never use them. This is just the statistics of what happens when, in the rare cases, police departments do use other mechanisms to diffuse situations. And as you can tell, if you are requiring them to use all other means before shooting, there's at least 25% fewer deaths. The organization Mapping Police Violence collected a lot of the data on the killings in 2017. They do this every year. But there's an interesting part of the piece here too. What they collect is the most comprehensive set of deadly police violence incidents every year. But we don't make this easy. You have to compile information from media reports, from obituaries, from tiny newspapers all over the place, from public records, from mortuaries, and from databases like Fatal Encounters and NRA databases and the Washington Post and other outlets. You can't just go somewhere, government to government, state to state, to find out how many people were killed by the police, how many people were killed by a gun. That statistic is not, you cannot aggregate it across this country. What people have to do to get that statistic is astounding. And that is all part of what we don't know and what we keep letting ourselves not know. Labor and employment, I know this area well. I started out as a union lawyer and a plaintiff's employment discrimination lawyer. The discrimination that runs rampant through this sector is in every part of your work life. Everything that you know about who gets hired, how much they get paid, who gets promoted, who gets punished, who gets the big retirement packages, and who gets to go in the place with the most toxic exposures and the most physical hazards. In one of my first cases, when I was a union lawyer, it was a thermometer factory in Brooklyn, and the two Mexican-American men who didn't speak very much English were given the responsibility of cleaning the vat that had sulfuric acid in it. Both of the men fell in the vat and died. There's occupational segregation. Of course, everyone knows there are occupations that it's incredibly difficult to get into if you're African American, or you're Latinx, or you're Native American, or you're Asian American. And on top of all of this is the individual mistreatment that people suffer at the hands of coworkers. So there was this gigantic study that was really done at the request of the Institute for Social Research in Norway, which is a great place. They looked at every single situation of hiring discrimination from 1989 through 2015. They looked at 54,000 applications. And these are cases where there are testers sent in, right? 2 resumes that look exactly the same, with exactly the same schooling, exactly the same honors, but one has an African American name, one has a white name, and situations like that. And they found that anti-Black racism in hiring has not changed 1% since 1989. I don't know what to say about that. That's a long time for this to stay the same. And the disparity between each of these groups and white applicants is still incredibly high. Okay, education. I know when we all think of like preschoolers, we think, okay, it's gotta be cool. It's preschool, like what could people do? But believe it or not, if you have an African American child, the chances are that they might be suspended from school. Even though they're only 18% of the population, they make up 50% of the suspensions. When all age groups are examined, Blacks are 3 times more likely to be suspended. And once they're suspended, the next time the police are called. And that just means the pipeline starts moving really rapidly. Once they're in the criminal justice system, Blacks are 18 times more likely to be sentenced as adults than whites. Our educational system is one of the most unequal in the world. Everyone knows this. If you're in the top 10 portion of the country in terms of wealth, the district will spend 10 times more than the district that somebody else might live in who lives in NYCHA housing. Students of color go to schools in buildings that used to be airplane part manufacturing facilities. I know, I brought 5 cases like that, where hexavalent chromium was climbing up from the basement up the sides of the school, and 2 teachers had sinus cancer before they understood that it might be from the chromium. But it's not just the buildings, it's the books. It's the curriculum, which is never innovative. It's the lack of computers. It's the gigantic class sizes. It's everything we know. And why does this continue? I don't know if people saw that, the statistic of the number of African American students that got into the magnet schools in New York. I don't really know what to say, that there was, I think, 7 out of 895 positions. Why someone didn't go to court today after that announcement yesterday, I don't know. But there's so much that can be done that it seems like, how are we not pushing for this, right? In medicine, when there were holes in the field, medical schools got together and said, okay, we have to create incentives to get doctors who are willing to be OBGYNs or cardiothoracic surgeons or whatever the shortage was. Why can't we do that for teachers? Why can't we equalize education spending? Why does it have to be based on how much your house is valued at? Why can't we raise teaching standards? Why can't we create incentives for teachers to stay in the profession, pay them more, reallocate resources from huge bureaucracies? This is the way it looks in many urban centers now. In New York City, 80% of the teachers are white. This comes from the City Department of Education. And 83% of the students are non-white. The cultural divide, as you can imagine, is huge. And teachers are writing about this all the time. So at the individual level, what can we do? Based on articles that I read from these teachers, we can make a real effort to diversify the profession, right? We can start teaching in a substantive way about cultural competence. We can teach teachers how to talk about class, status, and race in the classroom. We can teach teachers how to begin to understand the world that their students come from, to take a walk in the neighborhood, to go to dinner with students' families, to look at the way life is for their students. None of this is out of reach. One of the things we have to do, though, is at a very individual level, we have to stop with the sociological labels. We can't call kids at risk, disadvantaged, from a dysfunctional home, from a culture of poverty. All of that does is paint students as incessant victims, perpetual slaves, dysfunctional. How that gets internalized is unbelievable. And despite the fact that everyone knows the differences in resources, there are still teachers that blame students for not achieving. All I can say is, for those people, they don't belong in the classroom. What we need, instead of that trope of accusations and victimization, is understanding that each student has their own agency, resilience, determination, their own intellectual competence, and give them some credit. Okay? Homeownership, I think everyone knows this story. Redlining, restrictive covenants, you're being unable to sell white-owned homes to African Americans, discrimination in lending, divestment in communities of color. All of those things started many, many years ago, and they all still exist today. Most recently, what have we seen? The targeting of African Americans by predatory lenders for subprime loans, even when they qualified for prime loans, people lost their homes, people lost their entire net worth. The Urban Institute, which takes a look at a lot of issues on racism and equality, thinks that there's this misperception that is very pervasive, that people of color don't know about money, they don't know how to be responsible about money, they just consume conspicuously, and that they're not worth the investment. This is what homeownership looks like over the years from 2004 to 2018. The top line is white homeownership. The very bottom, I don't know, it's supposed to be dark red line, is black homeownership. Let's talk about wealth. According to a very recent Demos study, white families hold 90% of the national wealth. Latino families hold 2.3%, African Americans 2.6%. This wealth gap just keeps increasing, by the way. It has not reduced, it keeps growing. So I just put it right there. For every $100 that white families earn in income, black families earn $57.30. I wanted to tell this story that I read about in the New Yorker. It's an amazing story. There's a place in Nashville, Tennessee called Prince's Hot Chicken Shack. It's a family-owned place. It won an incredible award from the Beard Foundation. And the woman that runs Prince's, Andre Prince Jeffries, she's in her mid-70s. She's worked at Prince's her whole life. She inherited it from her great-granduncle, who died in 1960. The family were plantation slaves right outside Nashville, right near where Prince's is located. After the mayor started eating Prince's hot chicken, the place, everyone went wild, right? So now there's hot chicken places all over Nashville. And now there's Nashville-style hot chicken places like all over the world. Why am I telling this story? Because it had such a huge impact. How much this woman is known by every single person in Nashville. How much every person in Nashville knows about Prince's. How even during Jim Crow, people knew how to get in there and everyone ate together. And it's been there, and they've had their secret recipe for years. And this woman, Andre Prince Jeffries, runs this place. She's gone there at 4 a.m. for more than 40 years of her life. And yet, when the Prince's and hot chicken, well, when Nashville hot chicken makes it onto the national scene, it gets reported as being created by this man, John Lasseter, who created a competitor to Prince's, who's a white professionally trained chef. He went to the French Culinary Institute. What's there to say about this? Everything. He gets the public recognition. They, build a franchise. I don't think that Ms. Jeffries wants a franchise, but I do think that there's something wrong, that her invention and her entrepreneurship is not recognized, that she couldn't get a bank loan to expand, and that she doesn't have a way into any of those industry networks that he does. And I guess the story was so personal. That's why I was just completely struck by it, that even when you have something that everyone wants, and this is supposed to be the most addictive chicken on the face of the earth. People call it the crack of chicken. And I believe it is. Like, people eat there many times a week. Why couldn't it have been more for that family? There's so much I could say about healthcare. I don't even know where to start. You can see these statistics. The one that I want to say is the one that says 243%. Black women are dying in childbirth at an incredible rate in this country, more than in many developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't begin to know all of the things that create this situation. I do know from public health school, there's something called the social determinants of health. You know, where you live, how much stress is in your life, what your job is, who you have to care for, what your environment is, I know. But this statistic takes it out of the universe of so many other places that it's just hard for me to fathom. So here's what some healthcare researchers said about this: that the experience of being a black woman in America by itself is a risk factor, and that the stress that they are required to undergo creates such a situation that it puts them in that astronomical category. And here's the thing that I thought was amazing from this article. Here's this doctor who's at Harvard Medical School. She's commenting now, today, and she says, there's often an assumption in the medical world that racial disparities are due to something genetic. Excuse me? I thought we just learned that racial disparities have nothing to do with genetics. This is a doctor. You know, she says, okay, let me explain that. Racism is evil, and we don't want to see it in ourselves. So when black women come to us, we don't really respond to their pain. I know that there is some part of structural racism and white privilege that we've been taught. But I think that's a very, very tiny part of the story. And I don't think we should get off that easy. I think it's always in the interest of the people with privileges to keep them as things as they are. Here's what we do know, that the manifestations and justifications of structural racism, white supremacy, and white privilege is something that we do not talk about in this country. We don't. And so I wanted to engage in a little exercise, which actually was just recently used in a mediation course that I took. This same article. In 1988, Peggy McIntosh wrote what is now one of the seminal articles on white privilege. It's entitled White Privilege and Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And what Peggy learned from her students of color was how to look at the flip side of racism. And what she said she realized is she walks around with an invisible package of unearned riches that she can cash in on every day. And when you think about it, there are so many things that I decided I would just read a few. Here's what she says she can do. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. If I need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing a house in an area I would want to live in. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors will be pleasant to me, or at the very least neutral. I can open a newspaper and see people of my race widely represented in a positive fashion. I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. I can be pretty sure of having my voice heard in a group in which I am the only member of my race. Whether I use checks, credit cards, or cash, I can count on my skin color not to work against the appearance of financial reliability. I can swear, dress in secondhand clothes, not answer letters, not answer the door, without people attributing these choices to bad morals or the illiteracy of my race. I can speak in public without being asked to speak for all of the people of my racial group. I can speak in public without putting my race on trial. There are hundreds of these privileges, and they are everywhere in every minute of our lives. We can be sure that if we need medical help and we look white, that the race won't work against us. We can buy Band-Aids that come in the color of our skin. It's everything. And to me, that sounded pretty overwhelming. I was reading Michelle Alexander's book called The New Jim Crow, which I really recommend if anyone. It's very readable. And on one of the pages, there was a partial quote from Frederick Douglass, which I just thought was amazing, given the times we're in. A heavy and cruel hand has been laid upon us. As a people, we feel ourselves to be not only deeply injured, but grossly misunderstood. Our white countrymen do not know us. They're strangers to our character, ignorant of our capacity, oblivious to our history and progress, and are misinformed as to the principles and ideas that control and guide us as a people. The great mass of American citizens estimates us as being a characterless and purposeless people, and hence we hold up our heads, if at all, against the withering influence of a nation's scorn and contempt. That this seemed so much to describe the situation today is really all that needs to be said. 166 years later, we have to think about what does this say about our society, about our institutions, and what does it say about us? Thank you.
I'm sure you need to maybe stand up and stretch a little bit if you need to. I'm not offended. Please do what you need to do to feel comfortable.
Backwards, no forward. Just hit that key.
This is forward here.
Yeah, right there.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Thank you. We'll just give a moment or two to those among you that need a bathroom break. I needed one myself earlier, and I certainly understand the need to take care of yourself, so please go ahead and do it, and I'm sure my dear Rhoda will let me know when my time is up. Please, you don't need it. I have a watch on, Rhoda, but if you tell me approximately what time till, because I'm sure we're over. No offense. All right. Well, while our bathroom breakers are making their way back, I hope they're not going to run out. I will thank again the Network for Responsible Public Policy for inviting me. Rhoda has been on this journey to make this all happen. It hasn't been an easy journey in many ways because of the enormity of the subject matter, of course. The fact that as three very powerful women, we all come with our different ideas and focus, and how we will attempt in a very short time to cover the whole idea of racism. So it has definitely been a journey, and I'm very, very appreciative of Rhoda and the staff here, and most definitely my student on the right here who recommended me. At times I said, why did she do it? But nonetheless, I'm very, very appreciative. And I'm very appreciative of the fact that I have the opportunity to be able to talk about this particular subject matter. Just to give you some background, I look much younger than I actually am. Actually, the two in the back there, I'm the mother of them both. Of course, I'm telling a bit of a tale, but we we age well, the women in my family, thank God. But nonetheless, the subject matter was of great interest to me for a couple of reasons. Not only my growing up in the 60s as a child of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War and so on and so forth, but more importantly, in my academic education, graduate school at Columbia University School of Social Work, where there was no mention of the context of difference, of diversity. Quite frankly, I don't even know if we talked about racism. I'll have to think about that. And you would imagine in an urban setting that this would be something that would be discussed. When I began to teach at NYU School of Social Work, yes, we did talk about it. Yes, we did look into it. And I said to myself, finally, this is a time where I am being seen. And happily, somewhat happily, the Council of Social Work Education decided that diversity, the various isms, all have to be an important part of the curriculum for social work students studying. And so we even find it as a requirement for social workers who are going through yearly licensure. It is part of the continuing education that is required for all social workers as part of the Social Work Board, of which I was a member. But more importantly, for today's focus, this has a lot to do with what I call the urgency of now, a call to action to confront racism against African Americans in the U.S. for our children, our grandchildren, and their children. What I would like to say to you is the focus on children, grandchildren, and their children has a lot to do with myself and husband, please stand and be recognized, Mr. Cunningham, who have been recently afforded the opportunity to be grandparents. And as I gaze into the eyes of our lovely, lovely granddaughter, I began to feel, most importantly, what is the legacy that I'm going to leave for her? What is it that I can continue to do in spite of my senior citizen age to create an environment, to create a society where hopefully she will not have to go through many of the challenges that her grandmother had to go through. So hopefully at the end of this evening, you will have your consciousness raised about the subject of racism as it relates to African Americans. And I will focus on the experience of African Americans. And hopefully you will also get some idea, and by the way, my colleague, wonderful colleague, did most of my work this evening, and I'll have to take her to lunch for that, because I tell you, if there's anything about validation and the synchronicity of people that are interested in this type of work, you will see really the same, very similar presentation by me, and we did not absolutely compare notes. On the other hand, I will tell you that my husband will be in great glee that I won't have too much to talk about, because after presentations such as these, he always chides me that I have spoken too long. So you're in good shape today, Mr. Cunningham. I also hope you'll have a current understanding of some of the less explicit face of racism in the United States. Much of what's going on, even though we see it explicitly, is very much implicitly. And last, I hope that you will begin, if you haven't already, a sense of introspection, a sense of developing your own self-knowledge regarding the role of racism in your lives. And last, because I'm an advocate and a social worker, and this happens to be Social Work Month, I'm going to ask you individually to create your own action plan. However, you're going to utilize this very important information that you have gleaned from both Barbara and myself. So, what happens in the context of difference? We have, of course, racial ethnic prejudice, and you have a definition here, the holding of derogatory social attitudes or cognitive beliefs, so on and so forth. All of you are familiar with racial or ethnic prejudice. Second, we have discrimination. And discrimination is the action based on prejudice. So when we act in a discriminatory way, it is based upon being prejudiced. Last but not least, I want to call your attention to racism. I see racism as a multi-dimensional phenomenon. And I say it is a multi-dimensional phenomenon because it is much more than individualized racial and ethnic prejudice due to the exertion and the presence of the power dynamic. So when I teach this to my students, I remind them that we must examine race, ethnicity, and power. Because once you have the power dynamic in this situation, it changes the whole dynamic. Because once you have the power to be able to exert influence in terms of racial, ethnic prejudice and discrimination, it changes the whole reality. We already discussed white privilege. I also use the term white advantage because I believe it begins to, in a more concrete way, besides the assets, to see it as the extent to which there is an advantage for being white here in the United States and, of course, in many other countries as well. But we won't do that tonight, will we? Now, unfortunately, I was not able to share this Jane Elliott, Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes racism experiment. How many of you, please raise your hand if you're familiar with this. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, for those of you that are not, Jane Elliott was an old-fashioned teacher in the 60s and in Iowa, and she had her students engage in an experiment during Martin Luther King celebration, I believe. And what she did with her powerful presence is exert what happens in the context of difference. She had one part of her class who were brown-eyed to be the stigmatized group, and they wore collars around their necks. And she had the stigmatized group to perform in a less than situation. They couldn't play in the playground, they couldn't get extra snacks, all sorts of different things in regard to the classroom that made them less than. The next day, she had it flipped. And she had the Blue Eyes children, had them be the stigmatized group. Very interesting what happened, even though you might say this was a contrived kind of thing. But I tell you, she also did it with adults. So if you Google her, you'll be able to see the whole, the same type of racism experiment with adults. And some of the same things happen. This young lady here is shaking her head because just as the children fought and became upset, so did the adults. So it captures, for me, what happens in the context of difference when we begin to have a stigmatized group and a non-stigmatized group. The stigmatized children also had lower self-esteem. They were upset, some were crying. They had fights on the playground when they began to use epithets at one another. Oh, you're a blue-eyed, or oh, you're a brown-eyed. And so it really gives us an understanding of what happens when there are stigmatized and non-stigmatized groups and how they begin to feel. Last thing to mention, there were changes in the academic performance of these children. The stigmatized group performed much lower in their academic aspects when they were stigmatized. And when they were no longer stigmatized, their academics improved. Ooh, it worked. Oh, you just can't hear it. All right. Now, this other little video, and I do apologize that you can't see it, but you'll have to take my word for it. And since I am focusing on children this evening, I wanted to share this one with you also. You unfortunately, you won't be able to hear it, but it's a situation in which this little girl is being questioned by her mother because there are cakes missing from the household. So she's going to the little girl, who is her daughter, and saying, look, where are the cakes? All the cakes are missing from the household. What is it that you understand has happened to these cakes? And then the girl says, well, I'm not sure, I don't know, whatever. And as the mother continued to pressure her to tell her what happened with the cakes, she said, someone came in the house and robbed the cakes. So the mother, very smart woman, just like my mother was, she said, listen, how could someone come in and rob these cakes? They didn't touch the TV, they didn't touch the computers, they didn't touch the money, they didn't touch the jewelry. What happened that they didn't touch anything? And the little girl, unfortunately, says to the mother, well, it was a black man that did it. Now, what made me show this to you? I wanted to share with you what may happen in the socialization process of people, including yourselves. Because obviously, this youngster has been socialized to focus on a black man in a negative way. And so we cannot say, as my colleague has mentioned, that this is a genetic problem. It is a socialization problem. It is an institution problem. So I'm going to very quickly go through the next slides, but I think it's important in terms of looking at our history, and you notice I put his and her story because I want to make sure we have a bringing together of the history here. And these are just some of my references. But here are some of the accounts. You heard a lot of this from Barbara. And she didn't mention, though, the Bacon Rebellion, which she, I think, said a little bit about, not specifically, but when this racial force of both of indentured servants, including those that happened to be Africans, they were subdued. And by the way, just to give you some history, because it's so important, there's a Ghanaian word called Sankofa. And Sankofa teaches us, if we don't know our history, if we don't begin to understand what has happened, we're doomed to repeat it over and over again. And so the first historical account, of course, is that some enslaved African people were captured in Angola, West Africa, en route to Mexico on a Spanish ship. And while my colleague and I were talking a little bit, we mentioned the fact that slavery was so profitable and horrific that everybody, Europe, Portugal, Brazil, everybody had a piece of the action. And both she and I visited Ghana and reminisced that at one point there were 40-odd slave castles. They call them castles when they were horrific jails, but 40-odd along the coast in Ghana that housed enslaved people as they were waiting for the ships to come. So this is the situation here where these people, enslaved African people, were supposed to go to Mexico, but then here comes an English ship and they captured all of the bounty, including the enslaved people. And what we're told is the English people needed to have various food and other things, so they traded the enslaved Africans for those things, and this is how we ended up here in the United States. So again, I want to continue this theme of this objectification process. The objectification process is the extent to which we begin to no longer see people as humans like us. And if you'll allow me to just go a little bit off kilter here and remind you of what's going on with the Rohingyas. The Rohingyas are a group in, should help me, Suzanne. Thank you. And I've watched them because that group, over the years, when it was first being reported, are the recipients of the objectification process. So here are these people that look very similar to the people that live in this area, but all of a sudden, the Rohingyas, they smell, they're no good, we gotta get rid of them, all this kind of thing. This is all part of the objectification process. And when you look in terms of African Americans, you can see this objectification process very clearly, because those that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade were very much aware of the, shall we say, the wonderment, the universities that were going on, that went on in Africa, the religious experiences, the studies that went on. In terms of agriculture, for example, they were aware that dependent on certain areas in West Africa, there was a understanding of how to raise certain crops, including cotton. So it was to their financial benefit to perhaps get people from Gambia, because they were the people that would know how to do a certain thing, and to focus their efforts. It's kind of like a quality improvement process, those of you that are aware of that kind of thing. So this is why I say this objectification process is very, very interesting. And we must study it and understand it, both for the Rohingyas and, of course, for African Americans. But the institution of chattel slavery that proliferated during this period, and by the way, they're saying 10 to 7 million African people to North America during this time, to the Caribbean and South America. We, of course, believe it is much, much more. And for North America, 388,000 people. But anyway, for this institution of chattel slavery, as it began to move along, and remember, there wasn't any real policy. You know, we're about policy, I think, with our network here for responsible policy. So there wasn't any, it was a haphazard policy. But when we look at the history, as it began to be a lucrative endeavor for people, then we have lots of different policies. Now, I do want to call your attention to, you can get to see this as well. This is a video called Ethnic Notions. And it talks about the whole idea for the development of racial caricatures of African Americans. And the development of caricatures is very important because we begin to see this objectification process and how it begins to be even more concretized than we imagine. Jim Crow, who we know Michelle Alexander talks about, historically was actually a blackface character, a white man that put blackface on his face, and he called himself Jim Crow. And this was part of a minstrel type of show that this gentleman, Thomas Rice, was involved with. But it laid the foundation for the different types of racial caricatures of African American. The pickaninny, so we're not talking about a child who we love, who we want to see develop and progress. The uncle, the person that is in the plantation serving, very happy to serve. The mammy, the very large, obese black woman that also wants to serve. And later on, we see with the birth of a nation, which I will talk about briefly, is the whole caricature of the brute Negro, which is, of course, the violent, the mean black man that needs to be stopped. So again, we have the ending of enslavement, so-called, the 13th Amendment. You know, I tell you, we've had more amendments and laws to make African Americans free than the law allows, or shall I say, more grains of rice in Uncle Ben's rice. And I don't mean to be denigrating of Uncle Ben. But so many different laws, and still we haven't gotten right. And of course, the post-Civil War, you had the Black Codes, which intensified the second-class citizenship, and really, in many ways, the return to enslavement of African Americans. There was also post-Civil War on to the 1900s, this idea of sunset towns. And I want to just share with you that this idea of you may not, anybody familiar with sunset towns? Very good, very good, very good. This idea is that if you are a black person, that you better be out of this town by sunset. And if you don't believe me, I hope you believe me, because I do try to tell the truth. But Pearl River was one of those sunset towns. And while I was chief of mental health treatment services at Rockland Psychiatric Center, when we had a holiday party in Pearl River, most of the African American staff refused to go. So this idea is still very present in the minds of African Americans. And I'll tell you, it was so strong among my staff, I started to feel afraid and uncomfortable when I used to ride through that area. I also want to call your attention in the late 1800s, middle 1800s, you also had an increased numbers of violence against African Americans. And I call your attention to my fourth bullet here, because we often focus on the South. You know, oh, there, you know, even I think our president said something about Southerners. But you should know that in many respects, there is a feeling that in the North, we are just as racist. And the draft riots in New York City, many African Americans were killed, including the colored orphan asylums. So segregation during that time was relevant if you were an orphan. And that orphan asylum that was located between 42nd and 43rd Street on Fifth Avenue was burned to the ground by an angry white mob. And there were about 200 children, plus a number of staff that had to flee for their lives and obtain safety in a fire station. And as the firemen were trying to put out the fire, the angry mob wanted to fight them and hit them and stop them, even though it's possible the fire might have spread to other areas, including to the mob. But nonetheless, you know, what can we say? Meshuggah. Later, the home for the orphans was moved. So from 1900, 1960, again, lots of different policies, laws, and so on and so forth. But we also have the first meeting of the NAACP. We also have the Tulsa race riot. Those of you may be familiar with, they called it Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And this was a place where many successful African Americans had their businesses, had their homes, hotels, middle class, upper class people. And there was an allegation that a black man said something to a white woman in an elevator, and an angry white mob came and burned the town to ashes. And unfortunately, the family members of those who lost all of their hotels and property and so forth were never compensated for that loss. As it was with the Rosewood massacre in Florida, a similar situation where a African-American man was accused of beating a white woman and raping her when in fact she had been involved in a illicit affair with a white man, but nonetheless the rumors spread and we had the burning and killing of African Americans in Rosewood, Florida area. And for those of you that may not be aware, in 1936, a black postal officer, a worker, by the name of Victor Green, he wrote the book Green Book. Now, we had this wonderful Academy Award-winning story, but he originally wrote it to help African Americans in the North, and then began to expand it for people in the South. So I don't want us to think, as Northerners and Bergen County perhaps residents, that we were not part of the problem, because we certainly were. And in fact, he said here, it was easier, this is Mr. Green, the postal worker, he said it was easier to find a place to stay in Teaneck than Tenafly. So I don't know what to make of that, although I think there are some differences in the demographic between Tenafly and Teaneck. Then I do also want to call your attention to the seminal work by Dr. Kenneth Clark and his wife, Dr. Mamie Clark, talking about the damaging effects of racism on Black children that led to the desegregation that we have not gotten it that right yet. But nonetheless, Dr. Clark, who I had a chance to meet, mentioned that you can tell the evolvement of the society by the extent to which they care for the least among them. So he tells us, look at the infant mortality rates and so on. So we have also the White Citizen Council meets during this time. We have the horrific killing of Emmett Till in Monroe, Mississippi, where I have relatives, and I'll tell you about that on another time. We have the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, and of course, the killing of the 4 little girls in Bethel Baptist Church. And then we also see during that time the beginnings of the whole mass incarceration movement. And again, I want us to see this historically, because if we begin to understand our history, if we begin to understand the objectification process of African Americans in this country, we can begin to hopefully take steps to ameliorate it and make it better for our children, our grandchildren, and their children. And then onwards, 1962, you know, you can read all of the work of Johnson and Kennedy and so forth. And know also that one of the first Black teenagers that was killed in the United States here happened in Bergen County in Teaneck. And I do want to call your attention to the fact that this youngster, Philip Pennell, was killed by police officer Gary Spaff. And he was charged and acquitted of manslaughter. Now, they did an autopsy on Pennell, and it indicated that his hands were up when he was shot in the back. And this horrific situation with this youngster spearheaded the development on the Committee on Institutional Racism in the Teaneck school system that examined institutional racism in the schools in Teaneck, of which my better half here was a part. And so the committee concluded, and this is 1994, that institutional racism does exist in the school system of Teaneck, although not necessarily intentionally. And this was the Teaneck school system they're talking about, and some changes were made after that. We also had the 1991, the beating of Rodney King, and you see, once we got into the access of social media, right? We begin to have our attention called to these horrific beatings and shootings. Amadou Diallo, as you know, unarmed, shot very near where I grew up. Trayvon Martin, as you know, George Zimmerman, Kamani Gray. Michael Brown in Ferguson, I do want to call your attention to the fact that the policeman that shot him felt that Michael looked like the Incredible Hulk, like a monster, and that he felt the only way he could protect himself was by shooting him. And of course, there are so many injuries and killings of African Americans during this period that is much, much too many to name. May they all rest in peace. So again, my colleague has talked about some of the racial disparities among African Americans and evidence of institutional racism in education. And I think she pretty much focused on all of the different aspects that I have listed here. But I do want to call your attention to advanced placement because that's an area close to my heart, because our middle daughter started a program before she left Teaneck High School to help African Americans and other students gain access to honors courses. But as you can see, this is still an area of disparity. Black and Latino students represent 38% of students in schools that offer AP classes, but only 29% of students enrolled in at least one AP course. Black and Latino students also have less access to gifted and talented education programs than white students. And I will say, for that last sentence, I had lived experience with both of our daughters where we were told by their teachers that they should be placed in the gifted and talented classes. But for whatever reason, there was resistance in our town. And in fact, with our eldest daughter, we were told by her teacher, who is now a principal, that if our daughter wasn't admitted to the gifted and talented courses, they shouldn't have any courses. They shouldn't have anything for anybody. So you see, this remains a problem in terms of the access to improvement, the access to academic development, the access to the path towards middle class status for many of these students. Again, my dear Barbara talked a lot about debt and wealth, vast differences. I also want to just point out this issue of financial insecurity, where there is great disparity between African Americans and white people. I call your attention to the third bullet here. Financial insecurity is a situation in which people are financially insecure. Even though they may have a middle class status, they still are financially insecure, because if some type of emergency happens in their household, it plunges them into devastation. And we saw that, of course, in the Katrina situation. So of Black households with income between $50,000 and $85,000, 30% said they had been unable to pay a bill. By contrast, white households with incomes below $25,000 reported similar trouble paying bills. So you see the difference in income. 31% said they had fallen behind. A survey conducted by the Pew Charitable Trust indicated that Black households earning between $25,000 and $50,000 reported having emergency savings of only $400. Horrible. The average white household in that earning had $2,100. Also, an issue with debt collection, and we watch debt collection because I wonder the extent to which the disparity for debt collection and lawsuits also may lead to a prison pipeline for some people. The rate of court judgments from debt collection suits was twice as high in mostly Black communities versus white. The author stated that they found high rates in some neighborhoods, such as Newark and St. Louis, where more than one judgment for every 4 residents over a 5-year period. The authors indicated many families faced medical bills, job loss, and could not recover. Employment gap, I think Barbara did a great job. I will call your attention to the article. I don't know if it's the same one she referenced, but this is the American Economic Review, September 2004. Are Emily and George more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? I will leave those that are in HR and hiring to think about that and the extent to which that's relevant to your experience. Health status. Again, my colleague did a lovely job, but I'd like to call your attention to some of the scientific racism throughout the enslavement period of African Americans. You might not believe it, but there was a mental health diagnosis called dysthymania that was given to African American enslaved people who wanted to run away from being enslaved. It was thought that this was a mental health condition. We also know that African American women were operated on without anesthesia because it was felt African American people could maintain pain less without any type of anesthesia because they were in some way inferior to white people. And then, of course, you remember the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis, 1932-1974, where a group of African American men during the Depression They were paid, but they were not treated for syphilis. And Henrietta Lack, 1951, an African-American woman who attended Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, for a uterine tumor that her cells that were removed when they were doing the biopsy were utilized nationwide and internationally for medical research up until this point. So we have that. Now, again, my colleague talked about the issue of Black mothers, African-American mothers, in a life or death crisis when it comes to maternal death. This is, shall I say, a very personal statistic for me, because I too suffered with preeclampsia for both pregnancies. I was definitely middle class and had insurance, followed what the doctor said, but somehow had this very debilitating disorder. So again, let's look at the fifth bullet. Hypertensive disorders in pregnancy, including preeclampsia, are on the rise the last two decades, increasing 72% from 1993 to 2004. Now, just to let you know, preeclampsia leads to eclampsia, when the woman begins to seize, right? Those of you in the medical profession. With our first daughter, I was close to that, but we got it in time. Department of Health and Human Services report preeclampsia and eclampsia are 60% more common in African American women and also more severe. Black women are 3 to 4 times as likely to die from pregnancy-related causes as white women. There has not been an official federal count of deaths in more than 10 years. Now, you should know that New Jersey was aware of this problem, and that New Jersey, for quite some time, had a program right in Hackensack focused on reducing the maternal and infant deaths among African Americans. But a policy came into being under various administrations who shall remain nameless, and it was closed. So the, let's see if I can say this somewhat politically correct, but you know, if I'm not, so be it. So these programs were closed, but then when the Office of Minority Health began to focus on this issue nationwide, then New Jersey, some way, somehow, said the whole statistic had improved. And I'm talking about maybe the last 10 to 12 years, this situation. The closing, the statistics, and now, good news for New Jersey I have here, the last bullet. This is August 2018. Our present administration, the head of the Department of Health is aware that a black infant has a 2 to 4 time likelihood of dying the first year of life. And Black women are more than 4 times likely to die from pregnancy-related complications as compared to white women. And so New Jersey, hooray, has allocated $4 million, okay, we'll take it, it's not much, but we'll take it, to 6 maternal and child health centers. The program is entitled Healthy Women, Healthy Families, and services will include prenatal care, home visits, and early childhood resources. And there's also a pilot doula program in areas with high infant mortality rates. So let's stay tuned and make sure you see, because often we know what works. We have the evidence-based practices that work to help people. But when administration changes, there goes the change in funding, and there we are back to square one. I'm just going to give you this and begin to wrap up so there's some time for questions. If you haven't been convinced thus far that there's disparities in healthcare and income and so forth, please pay attention to this research that I want to share with you. This is racial disparities in the pain management of children with appendicitis in emergency departments, and this is from the Journal of Medical Association of Pediatrics. And this is from November 2015. And ladies and gentlemen, because, you know, I'm a teacher and a person that thinks data should be something that, you know, more than just what I come up here and say, I do try to use recognized journals such as this one. So this is a study, a cross-sectional study of information given in a national database from 2003 to 2010. So this is recent experience. 1 million children's care was reviewed of aged 21 and younger. The children had been diagnosed with appendicitis. So there was no ifs, ands, or buts. These were sick little puppies in the emergency departments and outpatient places. When pain scores were reviewed, Black patients with moderate pain were less likely to receive any analgesia than white patients. Those with severe pain among the Black patients were less likely to receive opioids than white patients. And the study of this included hospital visits in 50 states, excluding federal, military, and veterans hospitals. So what that says to me is that being a Black child can be hazardous to your health. I'm not going to go on in terms of criminal justice and so forth, but please look at some of this information. It is startling when you begin to review the enormity of it. Now, I do want to leave you with some things for you to think about. Yes, those of you that work in various institutions, various corporations and so forth, I hope you will begin to look at this idea of racism in a structured sense. And I don't know if we have any politicians in the audience, and I do hope we do have some with a political affiliation, but do begin to think in terms of ways in which we can impact this multi-dimensional phenomena of racism. But one thing that you can do, those of you in the audience, is begin to understand some of the very personal aspects of racism that may have to do with you. And so consider implicit bias, bias in judgment or behavior that results from subtle cognitive processes that often operate below conscious awareness. Implicit bias affected the way the policeman shot and killed Michael Brown, as it was with Trayvon Martin, as it was with Amadou Diallo. Aversive racism. This is a phrase utilizing the studies where many well-intentioned white people who consciously believe and profess equality unconsciously act in a racist manner, particularly in situations that are ambiguous. These circumstances are described as aversive racism, given the white person's aversion to be seen or called racist. These are some questions to consider, or that you might consider. What are your thoughts and beliefs about implicit bias and aversive racism? What are the thoughts about its existence in your home, your place of worship, and or workplace? Do you have evidence to support or negate its existence? Do you have a trusting relationship with someone who can help you reflect? Might that process impact your bias? Racial microaggressions. Dr. Daryl Sue, an Asian psychologist, coined the term. The everyday slights, insults, indignities, and invalidations delivered toward people of color because of their visible racial, ethnic minority characteristics. These microaggressions are stunning, subtle, often automatic verbal and nonverbal put-downs and social assaults that wound people of color unbeknownst to the perpetrator. They occur repetitively, and their impact can be cumulative, like 1,000 paper cuts. Imagine if you had 1,000 paper cuts, as opposed to one deep wound. Here are some case examples. I'll just do the short one. An African-American woman who I know very well, she lives in a large, beautiful house in an upper-class area. And when repairmen come to the home, they ask if the lady of the house is at home. You see racial microaggressions, subtle micro-insults. Number 3, a well-dressed Black executive at a major corporation who is part of upper management enters the elevator of the office building. There are 2 white men who are junior in terms of title to this man, and they ask him if they could help him, as if he didn't belong on that elevator. Here's some others. Your credit to the race. There's one race, the human race. A white man or woman clutches their purse or check their wallet as a Black person approaches. And if this happens one more time, you will hear about a crazy woman in Bergen County screaming and hollering because I just can't deal with it anymore. Intersectionality. I want you to remember this term as well because it's important. It is the study of intersections between different systems of oppression, such as racism, sexism, homophobia, that kind of thing, domination or discrimination, helps us to understand individual and systematic aspects of racism. The theory suggests that and seeks to examine how various biological, social, and cultural categories such as gender, race, class, ability, sexual orientation, caste, and other access of identity interact on multiple and often simultaneous level. We often look at people individually in terms of just race or racism existing. But if you understand the theory of intersectionality, we begin to see that person in front of you also have other accesses to their identity that influence their identity, how they see the world, and how the world treats them. So we have to begin to broaden our perspective of people. So we begin to understand race may be at working, class may be a point, gender may be another point, and all of these axes may be working all at the same time. You see this very relevantly, I think, with ex-offenders. And I was so glad when I heard that Mr. Diamond of Chase Manhattan Bank is beginning to open workforce projects for people that are coming out of prison. So again, intersectionality. What are your thoughts about this concept, and how can you incorporate your understanding of African Americans and racism? And last but not least, I encourage you, I motivate you, I support you in leaving this rather lengthy discussion on racism with a very individualized plan, perhaps only beknownst to you, where you would hopefully utilize the information that you acquired in this workshop, and that you write yourself a note, that you look at it a couple of times and begin to take action. Decide what guidance or support might be helpful and how you can obtain that support. And I certainly applaud the work of the network. And I ask most respectfully, and I hope you'll invite me to participate at some point, but I ask most respectfully that anyone that you invite to this podium to be part of these very important and urgent discussions, that they focus on the issue of racism. Because I will tell you, there is not a subject that will be discussed here in terms of public policy that will not in some way impact racism. And so I say to you, I know you want to get out of here and you're saying this woman is talking and talking and talking, but you know what? My little marigold is depending on each and every one of you in this audience to make a difference. So go out there and make a difference.
So thank you, Barbara and Lorna. This was really special, don't you think? Thank you so much. I know it's late, but it was so worthwhile having this wonderful conversation. We would like to continue with the question and answer session, but that's up to you. If you feel you have to leave, please do so, and those that want to remain, I think our speakers can give you a little time to get some of your questions answered. Questions? Wait a minute, we're going to bring the mic to you.
There's water.
Thank you. Extraordinary.
Thank you.
Okay.
Takes time.
At this time, even as someone who's terribly hurt, it almost hurts me to see all the hate that's going on continually every day. And my question for the two of you is, you've been immersed in this for years and years. Am I just seeing this now? Was it always this bad, or has it gotten worse?
You want to go first? First of all, I applaud your question. I think that you are not alone, that I haven't had a year teaching where students and people that are involved in seminars and workshops such as these, they come forward and say the same thing. They weren't aware of it. They just don't have a connection to a lot of the subject matter. And I will say to you, there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is, as I talked initially about the objectification process and the extent to which we are socialized not to be aware of it, not to be aware of our privilege and our advantage. There is a sundry and direct and explicit situation here that is meant for you not to be aware of it. That's number one. And number two, the awareness of it, I think, is multifold. Thank Spirit for data, for computers, for being able to video things, for word of mouth, and for people such as yourselves and people such as myself that are saying, look, we're not going for this anymore. So they're standing up, They're saying that something has to be done, and they're taking action. So I think that this is an answer to your question. I hope I answered. Please nod your head if I answered it. That this is a multifold, multifaceted issue that needs multifold, multifaceted intervention.
Is this on?
Get closer to
I would just add, I guess, a layer on that. I do think, I think that the professor's right that if we're talking about shooting of unarmed black men, I think we just are able to see it more clearly now. I mean, I think that that's really true. I think if we're talking on a global scale, I do think that there's a different phenomenon going on. And I do think that there is and particularly in Europe, a resurgence in hate.
Yes.
And I think it's reflected in elections that, we've seen in Austria, about what's going on in Germany and undermining Merkel. I think it was part of the push behind Brexit. I think that is happening. There are, political theorists give a number of reasons about why now, but I do think that's happening. I think the person that we have in the White House was, unhappily enough for us, the unlikely beneficiary of that trend. And I do think, in part, the fact that there's political power happening behind this hate that sanctions it and makes it much more okay to be absolutely overt, the way the National Front is in the UK, the way the far-right party is in Austria. I think they feel emboldened.
Thank you. Another question?
I guess as much as a question as a commentary, and what I'd like to say is this is just the highlights of something that could take a whole year of discussion and maybe even more to get to all of what's there. In addition, historically, there's so many things throughout from ancient history on, whether it's the Chinese exclusion in the past, or even the fact that people now think that the Neanderthals did not succeed in Europe where others succeeded was because of the culture, not because they weren't smarter, they were bigger, they were stronger, they were probably just as smart, but because of the culture of group identity that helped the folks that came in much later, like 60,000 years ago instead of 500,000 years ago. So group identity is sort of ingrained in everyone's culture, a much more.
Have you got a question?
No. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you.
Over there, Dan.
We'll get you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. And my question is, historically, are there any groups that have been able to make progress on their oppression or racism? And are there any lessons to be learned from them?
That's a good question. I don't know. I can't think of any. He said, is there any?
They're having trouble with that one.
Are you talking about demographic groups? Like I, You know, I think that there are very different experiences in all around the world. I have spent the last 12 years working for about 5 months every year in Namibia, Southern Africa, which is just shy of 30 years of independence out from under apartheid. It is quite an amazing place. It's a progressive parliamentary democracy with the most progressive constitution I have ever read. It makes ours look like medieval, which it kind of is. And it was independence born of negotiation through the United Nations process. There was a terrible apartheid history, a terrible colonial history in that country. No one was ever kicked out of that country. So if you go and you see in Parliament, you'll see, well, it's 67% women. But it's mostly an all-black Namibian Parliament, but there's about 6 old white Afrikaners that sit in the back and fetch about everything. There are still Afrikaner landholders, and somehow in that country, people have learned to live with the past and with each other and to move forward. I just happen to be fortunate enough to have seen what that looks like, and it's quite an amazing thing. But I haven't seen it in many places, no.
And to build on that, I'm not a global history person, or so what I speak to you is based upon my experience and what I have learned over the years. I do think that there is something to the idea that warring and not getting along with one another is intrinsic to the human experience. So to that end, for some reason, however, amongst the different ethnic groups in Africa, I'm talking about mostly West Africa, which is what I know more about, the system of chattel slavery that we developed here in the United States was not evident among those groups. There was a way in which people that were taken from warring ethnic groups, in other words, if I took you as an enslaved person into my ethnic group because our 2 ethnic groups were fighting, there would be a way in which you could become part of the community there. You would marry, you would have children. It wasn't the same type of slavery that we developed and evolved, and the objectification of people that occurred here in the United States. And to that end, I say that maybe that there's something to that in answer to your question.
Okay. I think we'll take a couple more questions and call it a night.
Lady.
Okay, right.
I have a question for both panelists. What is your belief on how racism is going to change now into the future?
Good point. Well, I'm a little worried about, I knew you are because, you know, I'm a little worried because we seemingly are at disparate points in terms of the range. So we have people that are very progressive-minded and positive-minded, but you also have so very many people that seem to be coming out of the woodwork that are frightening. And quite frankly, as an African-American woman, I'm fearful that I'm sitting next to some of these people in a theater or something, and they really absolutely hate my guts and want to kill me. Or I might get into a car accident, and it's one of these people, and they have a gun, and they might shoot me. So this is part of my lived experience. So I think we really have to make a concerted effort, in my mind, to begin to inculcate our nation and raise consciousness, as we tried very hard to do tonight, in terms of this idea of implicit bias, this idea of aversive racism, this idea of racial microaggressions. These things need to be conceptualized and implemented in curriculum, in the training of the police, as you most aptly put. It needs to be spread and discussed. And may I say respectfully, and maybe the FBI or somebody is listening, but I would say, and by the way, you know, oftentimes it says African Americans suffer from paranoia. We looked at it from a mental health perspective, and what we found, it's called cultural mistrust. Cultural mistrust, so we'll keep that for another time. But what I want to say is we have to have in leadership people that are going to help us to inculcate us with the fundamentals of what it means to be a citizen of the United States. Very simply, we may not like each other. We may not feel that we belong together, but there must be a way we can respect one another and not hate each other and want to kill one another. And as long as we have situations as what went on in Charlottesville, Virginia, what went on in Pittsburgh, what went on at Bethel Church, where people are going into houses of worship and killing people, where the Anti-Defamation League is telling us that hate crimes is increasing, I'm right now not so optimistic about the future in answer to your question. But as a soldier in the army against racism, I'm here tonight.
Okay, is there a last question?
I'm pretty loud. Not anymore.
Okay, no, over here, Dan. Dan? The young woman over here. And that'll be our last question.
So you talked earlier about the increased, I guess, benefit of the fact that now we have social media and we have body cameras on police, and things are being recorded so that at a minimum, the world can see what's really happening. My fear, my question, it's my big fear. By the way, I'm the mother of a biracial daughter, and I have a grandson who I love dearly who's about to start college, and he's 3/4 black. So I have a black child that I love more than life. And so, I worry. And when you talk about, oh, we're so lucky to now have more visibility via social media and body cameras, but yet, what do you attribute to the fact that despite all this, police are being found not guilty? They're shooting black men, running away from them in the back.
Yes.
And they get away with it. What do you see? What is that phenomenon? I mean, it's right in front of your eyes, and how do we combat that? My grandson walks out of the house every day, and he's a big kid. He's the varsity, wrestler in his high school, and he looks like a man. He's got a beard. I'm terrified for my grandson every time he walks out of the house.
Okay, let them answer the question.
Okay.
You want to go first?
Sure.
I could lie and say you're wrong to be terrified, but that would be a big lie. I think that the way to address this particular issue about the police is to make it an issue, to form a group, to join a group, to demand, to know exactly what the police are being taught, what the rules are and how they engage with people, what types of de-escalation processes they use, and demand it. And something that's very effective that people always, think doesn't do anything are Freedom of Information Act requests. You ask. You ask them to put it all down. And then if they don't, you sue to get it. And you get a newspaper to join you, and you force it out in the open. And it's one of the powers that we have, which is to force those who are in elected office to be accountable. And that's what we have to do. And it just has to be done on a more systemic scale than we're used to. And I'll just say one positive note, which is I've done some work with some of the children leaders in the anti-gun movement, in the wake of the Parkland shooting and some of the others. And they're very young, but they're really angry. And there's a lot of them. And I think that there are generations coming that will be very different from this one.
That's a wonderful note. to end this
Ma'am, I know
program
you
on.
want to end, but I must tell this young lady one other thing that's, I think, very, very important. And, okay, well, oh yeah, well.
Right.
An empowering thing for your children or your grandchildren is to help them know how to deal when they are accosted by a policeman. Because I think that, and I use these strategies myself because I will tell you, I am routinely stopped, okay? So this is not the time to engage in a power struggle. This is not the time to mouth off. This is a time to say, officer, what is the problem? No, I'm following the rules, or whatever the case may be. There used to be groups that were developed in churches and community centers that helped youngsters, such as your children, in terms of how to deal when they are accosted by the police. And I think we also have to be aware of areas where routinely Black teenagers are profiled in terms of a way in which to gain monies for that particular municipality, as it was in Ferguson, Missouri. I think that also parents such as yourself need to be part of the community groups in the precinct so they see your face and so they know Mrs. Jones, oh, that's her son over there, leave him alone. I think all of these strategies are things to think about. So I'm sorry, Rhoda.
No, that's fine. That was excellent. So on that note, we close tonight's event, and I think we're going to do more of these. Thank you for coming, and thank you for staying.